I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To follow up on the events in Europe the past week, we have with us none other than Max Bergmann, who is the director of our Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at CSIS. Max, we had a tumultuous time, to say the least. Munich Security Conference, negotiations with Russia. Can you help us understand all this and what it means for the U.S. and our transatlantic allies?
Yeah, well, I can try. I think maybe the place to start is actually before this week. And if you go back the first couple weeks of the Trump administration, there were the tariff threats against Canada and Mexico, and in some ways, Europe wasn't in the barrel yet. It was there wasn't a lot of focus on Europe. But that actually said something. If you look at Marco Rubio, when he became Secretary of State, his call sheet, of the first 15 leaders and foreign ministers that he called, there were only 2 Europeans. There was the Secretary General of NATO and Poland.
That's right. So no Britain, no France, no Germany.
Yeah, and no EU. And that says something. Like, we're supposed to have a special relationship with the Brits, and they're not part of the first 15 countries you call. Now, of course, that happened. There was a phone call, but it wasn't the priority. And I think what we see from the Trump administration is sort of real apathy toward Europe and the transatlantic alliance. So treating it very differently than, I think, the Biden administration, but really of most past American administrations. And so, but this past week was then Europe Week. We had the Munich Security Conference. There's a Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which the United States was formerly chairing. And it really started there, where Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth took the floor and gave a speech that I think many of us saw coming, right? If you looked at the writings of the incoming officials of the Trump administration, there was a clear sense that Europe was not the priority, that the Indo-Pacific was the priority, and ergo, the U.S. is going to shift gears, is going to pivot, and likely going to make defending Europe's responsibility.
Right, and this is part of the Trump administration, the president's stance that he wants to have a much more muscular foreign policy, and he wants to flex the muscles where he thinks is most impactful.
Yes, and also the sense that, look, Europe is rich and wealthy. Why is the United States providing Europe security? Why can't Europe do that? And I think that's a very reasonable sense. And I think the problem, though, is that the way European defense and security has been structured for really the last 80 years since the end of World War II is around the United States. And there is this sort of grand bargain where the United States leads on European security and the Europeans follow. And they're content with that. And so when we go to Afghanistan or in other places around the world, the Europeans are there. When we tell the Europeans you need to do export controls on China, even if it's going to hurt your industries, they do it. And yes, the Europeans don't spend enough and they've neglected their defense. But what they've done is they've structured all their individual militaries around the United States. If you look at a map of where all U.S. bases are in Europe, it's all over the place. We are the ones that provide for European security, and that's the way we have wanted it. When the European Union and the French try to say, hey, maybe us Europeans should get together, form a pillar of NATO, or have the EU do something on defense as they tried to do during the 1990s, we come in and say, don't do that. And so
we're in charge.
We're in charge.
And we like being in charge.
We have liked being in charge. And so what Hegseth indicated is that's going to change, that the United States wants to shift responsibility over to Europe. And that creates all sorts of challenges and problems. And it's not just about spending more money. It's about how you then structure yourself to defend Europe, because that was the U.S. role. So
it's a lot more than burden sharing.
It's a lot more than burden sharing. So that was to start the week last week. And then we had J.D. Vance both take the stage in Paris at an AI summit and then at the Munich Security Conference. And what was interesting about his remarks is that they weren't really focused on European defense or security. Munich Security Conference is a security conference. They were focused on Europe's internal politics, where he called out and critiqued the Europeans on tech regulation. And then I think in a way that really shocked and offended many in Europe, especially in Germany, basically said that the German parties needed to work with the AfD. This is the neo-Nazi inclined party that is now likely going to get second in the German elections, which are happening this Sunday. But a week before an election, you go and sort of intervene in German domestic politics, really caused real blowback. He didn't meet with the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. So,
and this speech with Vance comes in a situation where in Germany, the Conservative Party and the more liberal party have said they don't want to form a coalition with AfD.
right.
So even though AfD is getting a lot of votes, they're saying this party is against German values. They want to blow up our relationship to the Holocaust, et cetera, et cetera. And so German politicians, we're not going to form a coalition with them. Here comes Vance, and he says, well, you should.
Yeah. And look, what I would say is that this is something that European countries have had to deal with, their emerging far-right parties.
Yeah.
But in the case of the AfD also is one of the more extreme far-right parties in all of Europe. And so that has sort of prevented the other parties from really working with them. It's not just the other parties refusing, it's also the AfD has not moderated like some of the other far-right parties.
How extreme are they? Give me an example.
Well, their tendency has been to be very anti-American, very anti-NATO, very pro-Russian, but really hostile on immigration and migration, which now has sort of become the norm. But when it comes to the Germany's past, they really want to sort of control, alt, delete and sort of move forward and sort of forget the shame of the Holocaust.
I mean, I think one of their leaders, or maybe even the founder of the party, once said the Holocaust is just a dirty speck, and I'm
Yes.
cleaning up the language, on Germany's otherwise 1,000-year history.
Yes. And I think, from an American perspective, we at times have wanted Germany to act more like a normal nation and to invest more in defense and to lead more in Europe. But we're never telling Germany to forget what it did. And part of that, forgetting what Germany did, means that Germany can sort of go its own way again and lose its position as sort of the leaders of Europe. And so this is where I think the intervention in European politics caused a real shock at the Munich Security Conference.
Shock among the Europeans.
Shock amongst the Europeans.
Not Americans probably weren't shocked by this. I mean, some Americans were, but this government certainly has telegraphed that they were going to do something like this.
Right. And I think what we are seeing here with the Trump administration, we have a new report out called The Coming Collisions in Transatlantic Relations.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that too. It's on our website, The Transatlantic Alliance in the Age of Trump, The Coming Collisions.
And what we see mixing here is not just a fight over security, not just a fight over Ukraine, but also all these other more economic, domestic policy issues, tech regulations, tariffs. There's going to be a fight over climate change and EU climate regulations and climate trade barriers, and also the international order on the International Criminal Court and support for the Paris Climate Agreement. So you're going to see all these collisions happening on domestic and economic policy issues and on the security side. And I think the real fear for the transatlantic alliance is these fights aren't going to be compartmentalized. They're going to be blended together in a sense that they make the other fights worse. And what we saw with J.D. Vance is taking the stage at a security conference to then talk about domestic political issues, to talk about tech regulation. And I think this is setting the stage for what will be a very, very tumultuous 4 years in the transatlantic alliance. And it may irrevocably change how we view NATO and how the Europeans view us as a security partner, security provider, and as an ally.
The report is really fascinating because it goes through all the collisions you just described. And by the way, for our listeners, you can listen to the report as an audio brief on our website where you can read it, download it, however you want. I really learned a lot from listening to it. I hadn't thought back to some of the history about how, Britain has always supported the United States through every war, Iraq wars. France and Germany, of course, in the Second Gulf War didn't. Mm-hmm. And that was a big deal. And so that sort of plays into some of this as well. Tell us, how do you think the Allies go forward? I've been reading coverage where, reporting that says The Allies no longer view us as allies, they view us as adversaries.
Yeah, I've heard senior European diplomats describe to me that they think we're going through a divorce, and they're sort of shattered about that, but are now needing to focus on the future. And look, I think there's an upside here potentially, and I try to find the kind of silver lining. But
That's why your work's so great.
yeah, well, the upside is that I do think that transatlantic relations had gotten stale. I think under the Biden administration, and it's not just Biden, but I think the basically post-Cold War approach toward Europe meant that we started to take Europe very much for granted.
And we pivoted to Asia, we pivoted to the Middle East, etc.
And then we would get annoyed that the Europeans aren't spending enough on defense. Where really European spending on defense is to basically dock into the United States military and make the U.S. military stronger. And we started to take Europe for granted. And I think the Europeans were also quite content with the current bargain to spend not that much, but to have America protect them. And I think it does make sense. Europe is a very rich continent. They have the wealth to defend themselves and to deter Russia. And given the threat posed by China, to basically tell the Europeans, we need you to be stronger. And if you're stronger and if you can defend yourself, you'll be a better partner to us. I think it makes sense to try to begin that transition. And the Biden administration, by saying America's back, I think led to some degree of complacency. You can look at the defense spending numbers and they went up, but there weren't real reforms in Europe about how Europe could defend itself with less of an American role. And so I think the Trump administration is now going to really begin that transition.
So it's a really big shakeup.
A really big shakeup. The problem is Europe is so dependent on the United States that if you pull out and pull back very quickly, you will leave Europe very exposed. And there is this country called Russia that has shifted to a wartime economy, that has ramped up its defense industrial production, that now is, fighting an incredibly intense war. And then once you get on that kind of wartime footing, it may be that maybe the war in Ukraine dies down, but Russia says, well, now's the time to go at Europe. And so Europe has to take its security incredibly seriously at a time when, its simple ability to move forces around Europe, to, have the intel to be able to know what to shoot at, that's all the U.S. providing that. So that will take perhaps a generation to really replace, but it may happen very quickly. And that is what is leaving Europe feeling incredibly exposed right now and on the verge, I would say, of panic about their own security and about their place in the world.
And, some countries that are really close to Russia, bordering Russia, you've got Poland, you've got Latvia, you've got Estonia. They're shaking in their boots because they're really close to it.
Yeah.
These are NATO countries.
Yeah, these are NATO countries. And the U.S. security guarantee is essential. You can drive through Estonia from the Russian border in a few hours. So for Russia to get to Tallinn, they could overwhelm the NATO forces that are there very quickly and take these countries. It is a very real threat. And I think also maybe to step back for a second is sometimes we think that, man, the Europeans just haven't really been doing anything over the last decades. They've just been stagnant. This is a declining continent. It's actually not. You can really see it when you go to the Baltics because you're in Europe. You're in the European Union. And that's been 21 years now, since 2004. And Europe has spent a lot of money, spent a lot of resources in really helping these economies grow. And it's one of the most vibrant regions of the world now in Eastern Europe. It's a really remarkable feat. And so I think if I was going to take a step back, I would hope the Trump administration now can facilitate Europe beginning this transition where Europe becomes actually stronger by taking control of its security. But in order for that to happen, it can't sort of pull the rug away too fast. And that's the sense that the Europeans are getting, not just in Munich, but then when we saw Marco Rubio sit down with the Russians in Riyadh for negotiations.
Without the Ukrainians there.
Without the Ukrainians, without the Europeans that are providing just as much, if not more aid than we are providing to Ukraine. And when you look at some of the reporting around the Trump administration's grand plans, it all involves the Europeans picking up the tab for supporting Ukraine militarily and economically.
But they don't have a seat at the table. And so they feel cut out of these negotiations. And the other thing that Pete Hegseth did in his speech was to say that Ukraine would never be part of NATO, which, you could argue was sort of becoming the consensus here in Washington that wasn't going to happen.
but that's something you make a concession in a negotiation.
Right. It's a leverage.
And I think what the Europeans and the Ukrainians see is the administration making a lot of concessions to the Russians, but the Russians not making any concessions. What concessions have the Russians made thus far? The war is still going on. Russia is still bombing Ukraine. They are still on offensive in Ukrainian territory. And so there's real concern that what will happen now is that there'll be a deal between Washington and Moscow that will essentially sideline the U.S. from supporting Ukraine and will put a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians to agree to what would be a pretty terrible deal for them. And I think there's also concern in Europe that the United States may make an agreement with Russia about the U.S. force presence in Europe, about where its forces are located in Europe. Maybe the U.S. will say, okay, we'll pull our forces back from the Baltic. Maybe we'll pull out altogether. So I think there's real concern in Europe about this. And they're getting a lot of conflicting messages from the Trump administration, some reassuring words from Keith Kellogg, but then they will hear the president say things that seem to reflect Russian talking points about Ukraine, about Zelensky's popularity, about how elections need to be held in the middle of a war.
Well, and last night at Mar-a-Lago, we're talking on, February 19th, it sounded like he said Ukraine started the war. I think maybe what he meant was the war shouldn't have started at all, but it sure sounded like he was blaming the Ukrainians, not the Russians.
Right. And this, I think, was sort of further confirmed to Europe that they may be on their own here.
Yeah.
And what I would say is the Europeans have two reactions to that. The first reaction is we're helpless and we're screwed, effectively. The second reaction is, wait, we're actually not that helpless. We're 450 million people, the Europeans are, another 60 with the Brits.
And they have their own defense industrial base as well.
They have their own defense industrial base. They have the resources. And the question now is, can Europe act in such a way that both can come to the aid of Ukraine to potentially fill the gap left by the United States? Right now, the U.S. military assistance to Ukraine has run out. The Biden administration effectively spent down all the money from the last supplemental, which was passed in April of 2024. Trump administration doesn't look like they're going to request another one. So can Europe fill the military gap left by the United States? The answer is, I don't think great, but I think they can find ways to at least mitigate some of those gaps. And then can Europe begin to not only spend more on defense, but begin to take the steps to integrate their military capabilities so that they can deter Russia? And I think they can. And then when we turn to some of the other fights that are coming with the United States, when we talk about tariffs and tech regulation, this is where I think the United States really underestimates the strength of the Europeans, because the powers to respond are vested in the European Union. And last time there was a trade war and Trump won, what did the European Union do? It responded by hitting red states, by putting higher tariffs on bourbon, so bourbon's going to be more expensive in Europe.
That sucked.
That sucked. And blue jeans and Harley Davidson, and I think they'll do the same. And when it comes to tech regulation, this is where actually the U.S. kind of needs Europe more than Europe needs us, I think, where it's the second largest market in the world. Most U.S. tech companies aren't really doing business in China. And from a European perspective, there's a lot of, innovation and wealth being generated outside of Europe from U.S. tech companies, and they're providing open access to their markets with regulations. And so I think this is a fight that, if the Trump administration really engages and prioritizes this, at the same time they're pulling U.S. forces out, I don't see what leverage they really have. And I think what we're going to see is the Europeans kind of realizing that they can hit back. They have done that on trade. They will likely do it on certain climate regulations, and I think on tech. So I think we're going to have a very messy transatlantic relations. My hope is, at the end of it, Europe is actually a stronger global actor, and then potentially a stronger partner to the United States, and one that we will recognize that we shouldn't really take for granted as much anymore, and we should actually, instead of trying to fight with them about all these various issues, there's a lot more that we see in common, and that the transatlantic bond is actually very deep, and that there's a lot there that we can cooperate on.
And it's been going on for decades this way.
Yeah, I mean, the economic relationship between the United States and Europe is one of the most important economic relationships in the history of the world. I mean, it's truly astonishing. And so, it can, yes, we could have a trade war to the death in which the United States might technically win. On the other hand, it doesn't take a lot to cause a lot of pain to a lot of U.S. multinational companies. So my hope is there that we reach a détente similar to the first Trump administration, and the tech companies and the EU makes some, concessions on tech, that U.S. tech companies realize they're going to have to adhere to certain tech regulations that are law in the EU. It's sort of hard to undo certain laws, and that we get to sort of a better place. But I think before we can get to that better place, it looks like we're going to really duke it out in kind of every area. And it's going to lead to a lot of uncertainty, and it's going to make other countries, other powers, like the Chinese in particular, see that there's a wedge in transatlantic relations. And we saw this at the Munich Security Conference with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, talking about China upholds the rules-based international order and China's a responsible actor and taking action on climate and all these things that would quite appeal to the Europeans. And I think there's a danger here that things spiral out of control, and I think we need to try to avoid that.
Because a lot of the reporting about this is said, President Trump's just negotiating. But what you're saying is this type of negotiating could lead to real pain for Americans and for Europeans.
Yeah, I mean, he's trying to negotiate over Ukraine. I'm not too optimistic that where that's headed. But when it comes to Europe, there's talk of this grand bargain, but we kind of had a grand bargain, which was that
it's the ultimate grand bargain.
It's the ultimate grand bargain. Like, we're going to provide your security, and when we kind of lead the way on a foreign policy issue, you kind of get in line.
And we can get you to pay up more and more over the years incrementally, and we'll deal with that. And that's a real thing.
Right. And spend more. And that's been happening.
Yeah.
But it's been a grand bargain that everyone has sort of embraced. And yes, we're going to have some niggling issues on trade and tech regulations, but we'll try to work them out. And Europeans then basically try to accommodate us on many things, and some things not. But overall, this has been a good grand bargain. And so the problem I see with trying to negotiate a new grand bargain is the Trump administration sees the security guarantee as leverage. And we've seen J.D. Vance say this explicitly during the campaign, that if you're not respecting quote unquote free speech and doing all these tech regulations, why would we ensure your security? But I think the Trump administration is going to pull back on the security side, reduce U.S. forces. That was clearly what Hexas signaled. At the same time, we're going to expect all these concessions from Europeans on the economic and tech side. And I just think, if you're pulling back your leverage, it's going to prompt the Europeans to hit back harder. So I am very skeptical of a grand bargain. I'm also skeptical because Europe is not structured to do a grand bargain. NATO is where the security conversation takes place, and the economic and regulatory conversation takes place at Brussels at the EU. And yes, the member states are the connective tissue, but the EU is empowered here. And I think Americans are going to learn a lot about qualified majority voting, which is basically the EU can take action without unanimity on all these economic and regulatory issues, which means that, the Hungaries don't block it, right? So the idea that you got some Trojan horses and that will inhibit the EU from responding, no, the EU can hit back, and it can hit back very hard. And they've been thinking about how they're going to respond to this. And it'll be much like what Canada and Mexico threatened in retaliation. And the hope is that we have a similar outcome where we can sort of
make a deal with Canada and Mexico, make a deal with the Europeans.
Yeah.
That's the hope, for sure. I want to go back to U.S., Russia, and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. It was the first meeting between the U.S. and Russia in 3 years. Some of the coverage coming out of there, Sergei Lavrov indicated that the U.S. and Russia were really listening to each other for the first time in quite a while. What did you make of all this?
I think it was a big win for the Russians that they've been isolated diplomatically from the West. And here was the United States sending a signal that we're ready to sit down and you have some legitimate grievances and we're willing to talk to you without the Ukrainians, right? So this wasn't really a peace negotiation. It was really a bilateral talks between the U.S. and Russia that was more than about Ukraine, but about having a stronger bilateral relationship. And so where I look at this is I don't see any indication that the Russians are willing to make any significant concessions on anything. I don't think Vladimir Putin has really shifted from his grandiose war aims of subjugating Ukraine and killing off Ukrainian democracy. And I think what the United States needs to do is extract some concessions from the Russians that they are recognizing that they're not going to win this war on the battlefield, and that they're not going to take Ukraine, and that this war needs to end. And I have not seen any signals from Russia that that's the case.
And what we saw from President Trump at Mar-a-Lago was that he said, some pretty derogatory things about Zelensky. Said Zelensky's approval rating is at 4%, which I don't believe is correct.
Not true at all.
As we're recording this podcast, there's new language coming out from President Trump where he calls Zelensky a dictator. What do you think about this?
Well, I think it's troubling, and I think the signal that it sends is that the United States is not that committed to Ukraine. And part of what the negotiations that happened in Riyadh were the United States not going to those negotiations as an ally and backer of Ukraine, but more as a neutral arbiter. We've sort of taken off our pro-Ukraine jersey and put on a referee's jersey. And then you have Trump here disparaging Zelensky, saying he's at 4%, calling for new elections in the midst of a war, which is something, the Brits didn't do. Churchill didn't run for election during the war. And if I were in Kyiv, I'd be very worried that this administration is not interested in continuing to support Ukraine and is looking for a reason not to. And the Russians are going to try to give them lots of reasons not to, and one of which would be like, oh, they refused to hold an election. How could we even sit down for negotiations? Or to force Ukraine to be the one to make all the concessions. And then when Ukraine says no, you can say Ukraine is being unreasonable. We tried to have negotiations, but we're now stepping away. And I think the Europeans see this and see the writing on the wall. I think the problem is that Europe is still having a conversation that is about putting peacekeepers on the ground, which I think is a good discussion to have, but that assumes that the talks go somewhere. And I think where they really need to reset is assume that the talks don't go anywhere, that Ukraine will have to say no, and that Europe can empower Ukraine to say no. Because the fear of Ukraine conceding to what would be a bad deal is that it would actually just enable Russia to continue to ramp up its defense industrial production, to continue to build up its forces, and would lock Ukraine out of its European future, not just out of NATO, but potentially out of the European Union as well. And so I don't really think that Russia has lost any interest in continuing this war. And so I think the broader fear here is that the United States is laying the groundwork to pull the plug on Ukraine, and the Europeans need to be wise to that. And I think Ukraine is seeing that as well. And that's part of the reason why Ukraine was sort of panicking, offering to sell a bunch of its critical minerals to the United States. And then the United States came with a deal, and this has been leaked, that was essentially Ukraine selling off its mineral rights, not in exchange for another 5-year commitment of U.S. aid, but basically to pay the U.S. back for
the last 3 years.
For the last 3 years. And so Zelensky was like, that's not a deal. So I think Ukraine is in an incredibly tough spot. But I think every U.S. ally around the world that is dependent on the United States for their security is looking at Ukraine, is looking at Europe right now and saying, are these guys reliable partners? If you're in Taiwan, are you thinking that this administration will be there for you if war comes down? I know many in the Trump administration would want to, but I think there's real questions about the U.S. as an ally and partner around the world.
Max, what would a good deal in Ukraine look like? What would a bad deal in Ukraine look like?
Well, it's a very good question. I think a good deal for Ukraine is one where Russia effectively agrees to stop fighting. I mean, obviously, Russia should pull out all of its territory, but a deal in which Ukraine does not have to recognize that the Russian-occupied territory as now being part of Russia. And this is what the U.S. did with the Baltic states during the Soviet period. We never recognized that they were part of the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union annexed them. So that Ukraine doesn't make that concession, number one. Number two is a deal that enables Ukraine to realize its European future. That's what this is all about. This is, in 2014, when there was the Maidan protests, it was about Ukraine having a closer relationship with the European Union. To me, NATO is a vehicle for Ukraine to join the European Union. And if you take NATO membership off the table, which I think is something that I could see Ukraine making that concession along the lines of what Finland did during the Cold War period. And Finland did join the European Union in the 1990s, but that Ukraine joining the European Union, which does have an Article 5 equivalent in Article 42.7, so there is an element of a security guarantee, and able to sort of focus westward and not have to be nervous that Moscow would come at it at any moment. And then I think as part of that deal for Ukraine would also be a commitment to continue to rebuild the Ukrainian military. This is going to be a race to deter Russia if there is ever a deal. And that means investing a lot in the Ukrainian military so that, like Israel, no one really wants to mess with it. And that's going to require a lot of money and a lot of resources and a lot of commitment. The problem is, so a bad deal for Ukraine is a deal in which effectively forces Ukraine to recognize the territory that they've lost as being Russian territory, and so essentially legitimizes the carve up for Ukraine. I think that's in some ways worse for the world than it is for Ukraine, because it makes Russia look like, hey, we got away with this, number one. Number two would be a deal that prevents Ukraine from ever having a European future, that locks it out of the European Union and NATO and leaves it in this gray zone in which Russia can do what it's doing in Georgia, using corruption to influence Ukrainian politics, but then also lays the groundwork for, in a few years, perhaps as the U.S. and Europe kind of lose sight of supporting Ukraine, decide that Russia's going to go back in. So you could also see the Russians making a lot of requests for the demilitarization of Ukraine, and that would essentially just enable Russia to go back again and take out Ukraine. And there's one last element, which is I mentioned earlier, but something that involves not Ukraine, but the U.S. position in Europe, U.S. military position, whether U.S. forces or NATO forces can be positioned forward on the Russian border to protect the Baltic states. Any concessions there would be a huge blow to NATO, and we know that's what Putin wants, because in a letter in December of 2021, before the invasion, Putin said to Biden, basically, you don't want me to invade, here's my demands. Basically, NATO goes back to its 1997 borders. And that, I think, is a recipe for insecurity in Europe beyond Ukraine.
Max, this is a lot to think about, and I know we'll be talking about this in the days and weeks to come. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.